Ms. Adele, the assets designated for you consist of one handwritten cooking notebook recovered from the kitchen cabinet of the property at 14 Chartres Street. All remaining assets, including Maison Fontenot restaurant, the commercial land parcel in the warehouse district, and the decedent's bank accounts, are to be divided equally among the three heirs, Mr. Christophe Fontenot, Miss Marguerite Duplessis, and Mr. René Fontenot. The attorney kept reading. His voice was even and effectless, like a man reciting a menu at a restaurant where nothing is worth ordering. I sat in his dark paneled office on Canal Street and stared at my hands. My hands. 72 years old. Fingers that had held a kitchen knife for more than 50 years, that had chopped so much onion the smell had worked its way permanently into my skin. No amount of washing ever got it fully out. These were the hands that learned from my mother, from my grandmother, from the women of Louisiana who stood at the stove from before dawn until after midnight. These were the hands that built Maison Fontenot from a rented kitchen 40 years ago. And what I received was a tattered notebook. Christophe, my oldest son, 45 years old, sat at the head of the table wearing the smile of a man who already knew the outcome. Beside him was his wife, Sylvie, a woman who in 15 years of marriage had never once set foot in a kitchen and was in the habit of calling traditional Creole cooking old lady food. Marguerite, my daughter, stared out the window in the way people stare out windows when they want to disappear. René, the youngest, was looking at his phone. I looked at the notebook sitting on the table. Brown leather cover worn soft with age. I recognized it immediately. This was Auguste's book, the one my husband had used to record our first recipes back in 1985 when we opened the restaurant. I picked it up, said nothing, stood, and walked out of the attorney's office while he was still reading the clauses governing the distribution of assets. Sylvie said something as I passed. I heard it clearly, but didn't turn around. That settles that. I'll deal with the Treme cottage next week. The Treme cottage, the house where I had given birth to all three of these children. I stood on the sidewalk of Canal Street in a November New Orleans afternoon. The kind of November afternoon this city has, still humid, but gentled. A river wind off the Mississippi carrying the smell of silt and history. I stood there with the notebook in my hands and asked myself a question that needed no immediate answer. So this is how they repay me? No tears. I was past the age when tears come right away. Now they came slower, but when they came, they were more honest. This wasn't their time yet. This was time for thinking. My name is Adele Marie Fontenot, née Thureau. I am 72 years old. I was born in Treme, the oldest African-American neighborhood in New Orleans, a place of music and food and history that the whole country comes to see, but not everyone truly understands. I learned to cook from my mother and my grandmother, and I have been a professional cook since I was 17. I built Maison Fontenot with my husband from nothing into one of the most recognized restaurants in the French Quarter. And today, they handed me a tattered notebook and told me to go back to the old cottage. I flagged a cab to Treme, not because I had no other way home, but because I wanted to sit in a taxi and watch New Orleans go by through the window and give myself time to arrange my thoughts before walking into the house where I had lived for 72 years. The wooden cottage at 22 St. Claude Street one of the oldest streets in Treme, lined with classic Louisiana shotgun houses and the oak tree out front that my father planted in 1952. I unlocked the door with the key I still carried even after 3 months away, ever since Auguste fell gravely ill, and I'd had to stay at Christophe's house on Esplanade to help with his care. 3 months in my son and daughter-in-law's home, sleeping on a daybed in the den, eating food that Sylvie cooked the way a person cooks when they don't care what they're putting on the plate. The kitchen of the cottage on St. Claude. This was where I first learned to make gumbo at age 10. This was where Auguste and I tested recipes night after night before we opened the restaurant. This was where all 3 of my children sat at the kitchen table doing homework while the smell of roux browning drifted through the room. I set the notebook on the kitchen table, poured a glass of water, sat down, and I thought about Auguste. I need to say more about that Friday evening in the Treme kitchen, because it wasn't just a meal. It was the most important moment in this whole story, and no one else was there to see it. I got home around 4 p.m, unlocked the door. The smell of the old house, wood and thyme, and the particular scent of a Louisiana home that has stood through many decades. My father's oak tree cast its shadow across the parlor floor, through the front window. I didn't sit down right away. I walked through each room, the bedroom, the parlor, the hallway, the way you do when you've been away too long and need to confirm that everything is still there. Everything was still there, including the small things. My grandmother Eulalie's wall clock in the parlor, and the blue ceramic vase on the shelf that Auguste bought at a flea market when we were young, the black and white photograph of my mother on the bookcase. Then I went into the kitchen. The refrigerator was nearly empty. No one had been home in 3 months. But the dry pantry still had the basics: flour, butter, dried onion, garlic, dried bell pepper, filet powder, dried thyme. Enough for a pot of gumbo if I picked up sausage and fresh produce. I walked to the little grocery at the end of St. Claude, the Nguyen family store, Vietnamese-American in Treme, since 1976, neighbors we had known across 3 generations. Mrs. Nguyen was at the counter and said the moment she saw me, "Miss Adele, you're back. God bless Mr. Auguste." Nothing more. Nothing more was needed. I bought andouille sausage, shrimp, fresh onion, green bell pepper, celery, enough for a 1-person pot of gumbo, but I made enough for 4, because that was how I always cooked, and because I had no interest in cooking less. Back home, I lit the burner, pulled out the cast iron pot. That pot had been with me since my mother gave it to me before my wedding. 43 years. Set it on the stove, added flour and butter, and started stirring. The tears came when the roux turned to a deep caramel, not from sadness in the ordinary sense, but from the smell. The smell of roux browning was the smell of every kitchen evening across 40 years. The smell of Auguste sitting at the kitchen table watching me cook. The smell of children doing homework and looking up when something good was bubbling in the pot. I let the tears fall and kept stirring. Roux doesn't wait. That Friday bowl of gumbo was the first meal I had cooked for myself in 3 months of eating other people's food. I sat at the kitchen table, alone, with the pot of gumbo and Auguste's notebook, and the warm yellow light of the old kitchen. It was not a sad meal. It was the meal of someone who had come home. Auguste Jean-Pierre Fontenot was born in 1945 in Tremé, 3 houses from mine. We grew up together, went to the same school, and knew each other before either of us was old enough to understand that the other would become the most important person in our life. Auguste was not a cook. He was an accountant, a man of numbers, of documents, of precision. But he loved food the way a true Louisiana man loves food. He understood that the kitchen was the soul of a home, and that a meal was the language of love. Adele, he said to me in 1983, when we were newly married, and I was working as a sous chef at a restaurant on Bourbon Street. You cook better than anyone I've ever known. Why are you working for someone else? Because you've never paid me a dime, I said. He laughed, then got serious. I mean it. Let's open our own place. You cook, and I handle the money, 50-50. 2 years later, in 1985, Maison Fontenot opened its doors for the first time at 14 Chartres Street in the French Quarter. Not a grand debut, a small townhouse with 12 tables, a cramped kitchen, no staff beyond Auguste and me, and a dishwasher named Benny from the 9th Ward. I cooked. Auguste managed. And we built Maison Fontenot from nothing into something worth fighting over. People see a restaurant from the outside, a noted spot in the French Quarter, reservations booked a month out, Louisiana Culinary Awards. They don't see what happened before all that. Auguste and I didn't have a Valentine's Day dinner for the first 20 years because that was the busiest night of the year. No Christmas dinner together as a family because Christmas evening was our biggest service. No long vacations because the restaurant needed managing. Every year on December 27th, our shared birthday, born on the same date, different years, something Auguste always called evidence that the universe had a plan. The restaurant closed for one day. Only that day. Auguste would take me to dinner somewhere that wasn't our restaurant, and we would sit like ordinary people and not talk about work. December 27th, 2020, the year Auguste turned 75 and I turned 68. We had dinner at Antoine's, the oldest restaurant in New Orleans. Auguste set his hand over mine on the table and said, Adele, if I could do it all over again, I'd still choose you. I looked at him, even knowing everything that was coming, even knowing all of it. That was our last birthday dinner together before he got sick. The following year, December 27th, 2021, I sat alone at the kitchen table in the Tremé cottage and cooked gumbo for myself. 43 years of marriage to Auguste Jean-Pierre Fontenot. Not 43 perfect years. No one has 43 perfect years. But 43 years with a man who put his hand over mine at Antoine's and said he'd choose me again. The pre-signed check tucked inside the notebook. That was Auguste's love language. And the language of an accountant, a man of numbers and documents. I can't stay beside you forever, but I can make sure you're protected after I'm gone. People don't see what happens before a restaurant becomes famous. They only see the result, the magazine write-ups, the reservations a month out, the award from the Louisiana Culinary Association. They don't see the early years when I got up at 4 a.m. to go to the market for fresh ingredients, came home to make stock, then set up the mise en place for lunch service before daylight. They don't see the late nights sitting with Auguste reviewing the books, worrying about next month's rent, doing the math to see if we'd make it. They don't see 1991, when Hurricane Andrew tore off part of the kitchen roof, and we used every cent of savings to fix it. I sold the small diamond ring my mother had left me, the only piece of jewelry she owned, to cover the contractor's deposit. Not one of my 3 children knows that to this day. And they don't see 1995, when Christophe, 15 at the time, got picked up by the police after a fight at school, and I had to leave the kitchen mid-service to go to the station, got home at 11 at night, then finished cleaning the kitchen alone because there was no one else. They don't see 2005, when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and Maison Fontenot was flooded to the threshold. I stood in my kitchen knee-deep in water, lifting the recipe notebooks one by one, the tools I'd cooked with for 20 years, carrying them out before the water climbed higher. Then we rebuilt from scratch. Christophe was 25 at the time. He didn't help with the cleanup. He had evacuated to a girlfriend's place in Houston. I didn't blame him. He was young, but I remembered. I remembered all of it as I sat at the kitchen table in Tremé with Augusta's notebook in my hands. There is something I want to say about the cooking tradition in Louisiana and about the women in this craft who came before me, because my story cannot be fully understood without that context. Creole Louisiana cuisine, gumbo, étouffée, red beans and rice, bread pudding, jambalaya, is food known all over the world, and it was built by Black women in other people's kitchens going back centuries. Not by the celebrated chefs you see in magazines, not by the upscale restaurants in the French Quarter, but by women like my grandmother, Eulalie, who stood in someone else's kitchen from before dawn, learned from their mothers and grandmothers, and passed it down to their children. When tourists come to New Orleans and walk into a fine restaurant for traditional Creole cuisine, they are eating the heritage of those women. Or what they don't know, what few people talk about, is that for most of the history of Louisiana cooking, the women who created those dishes were never allowed to put their names above a restaurant door. My grandmother Eulalie cooked for a Garden District family for 40 years. Every large dinner party, every holiday feast, she cooked them all. The guests complimented the food. The hostess accepted the praise, and my grandmother Eulalie rode the bus home late at night and showed up the next morning and did it again. When Auguste and I opened Maison Fontenot, I understood that what I was doing was not just opening a restaurant. I was putting a Creole woman's name above a restaurant door in the French Quarter, something the women before me never had the chance to do. That was what Sylvie called smelling like onions and couldn't understand, and what Christophe looked at as a balance sheet and couldn't see. That Maison Fontenot was not just a restaurant. It was the continuation of a story longer and more important than any $3,200,000 transaction. When I stood at the kitchen table teaching Marcus how to make a roux, I was doing what my grandmother Eulalie had done for my mother and what my mother had done for me. That circle could not be broken by a will or a signing ceremony or a pair of aprons in a trash can. I need to say more about Hurricane Katrina in 2005, because that was when Maison Fontenot was tested in the truest sense, not by the market or by competitors, but by water. We evacuated before the storm. Auguste drove me and Renee and Marguerite up to Baton Rouge to a relative's house. Christophe was 25 and had a girlfriend in Houston. He went with her. When we returned to New Orleans 3 weeks later, parts of Treme were knee-deep in standing water. The St. Claude cottage was damaged but standing. It had survived many storms before, built the way old Louisiana people knew how to build for hurricanes. But Maison Fontenot on Chartres Street had flooded deeper. I stood at the door of the restaurant with water to my knees and looked inside. The refrigerator was tipped over. Kitchen shelving had collapsed. Tables and chairs had drifted and settled, everything coated in a thick layer of black mud left behind by the retreating flood. Auguste stood beside me, also looking. Neither of us said anything for about 10 minutes. "We rebuild," he said finally. "Rebuild with what?" "We'll figure it out, like the first time." It took us 14 months to rebuild Maison Fontenot after Katrina, not just because of money. The insurance settlement came late and wasn't enough, as it was for most small New Orleans restaurants at the time. But finding skilled kitchen contractors in a city that was trying to rebuild everything at once was its own challenge. I worked as a fill-in-line cook at another restaurant during that stretch, not because of immediate financial need, but because I didn't know what to do with my hands if I wasn't cooking. Our Auguste managed the insurance paperwork and the contractor bids and all the administrative headaches that beat people down in hard times. Christophe came back to New Orleans about 2 months after Katrina, not to help with the cleanup. He had his own reasons, but he came by the restaurant once, looked around and said, "Mama, have you thought about just not reopening? Take the insurance money and move on." I looked at my son. Move on to where? Houston, Atlanta, anywhere. Start over somewhere new. This restaurant belongs to Grandma Eulalie's legacy. This is where we brought the Fontenot name into New Orleans dining. Grandma Eulalie never had her own restaurant because her time wouldn't allow it. I am not walking away from this. Christophe didn't argue further. But I saw something in his eyes that I would recall 19 years later when he signed his father's will. He didn't understand why this mattered the way it mattered to me, and that was not entirely his fault. Maison Fontenot reopened in November 2006, 14 months after Katrina. On the first dinner service after reopening, I stood in the freshly painted white kitchen and looked out into a dining room full of guests, local people, not tourists, New Orleanians coming to welcome back something they'd missed. I thought of Grandma Eulalie and thought, we're still here. The week before Auguste died, he died in October this year after 3 months of severe pancreatic illness. Sylvie cleaned out the den, where I'd been staying at Christophe's house on Esplanade, and piled all of my belongings in a heap in the corner of the hallway. Included in that pile were my aprons, 3 kitchen aprons I had used for 30 years, one with Maison Fontenot embroidered across the chest, the other 2 the kind I wore when cooking at home. Sylvie put them in the trash can at the curb. I saw it through the den window. I went outside, retrieved them from the trash. Sylvie stood in the doorway watching. "Mama, those are old. The smell, I can't stand it." The smell of the kitchen, the smell of roux browning, of garlic sautéing in butter, of thyme and bay leaf and filet powder, the smell of Louisiana cuisine that people paid hundreds of dollars a meal to experience. "I know," I said. "This is the smell of 35 years feeding this family." I took the 3 aprons back to the den, folded them, put them in my bag, and 2 days after Auguste died, I left Christophe's house and went back to the cottage in Tremé with 1 suitcase and 3 aprons. I was born in this cottage in Tremé in 1952. My mother, Cécile Marie Thureau, delivered me in the front bedroom with the help of a neighborhood midwife, because the hospitals back then weren't where Creole women of African descent in Tremé tended to go. My mother was the first person who taught me to cook. She had learned from my grandmother, Eulalie Thureau, née Marchand, who was born in 1908 and had been cooking professionally since she was 15 years old, in the big houses of the Garden District, the way black women in Louisiana so often did in those years. Talent working behind the scenes, the credit going to the household. My grandmother Eulalie never had her own restaurant, not for lack of talent. Everyone who ever ate her gumbo said it was the finest they'd ever tasted. But in her time, women like her didn't have those options. When Auguste and I opened Maison Fontenot in 1985, Grandma Eulalie was 80 years old and could no longer stand for long. I brought her to see the townhouse on Chartres Street before we opened. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked in, silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Cocodelle, this is something I never had. You hold on to it, you hear me." I held on to it 40 years. I held it for Grandma Eulalie and for my mother, and for every woman who stood in someone else's kitchen and was never allowed to stand beneath her own sign. And when Sylvie threw my aprons in the garbage, when my children handed me a tattered notebook and signed away $3,200,000, what they didn't know was that they weren't only disrespecting me. They were disrespecting every woman before me who had made this possible. I thought of Grandma Eulalie when I walked into that conference room on Gravier Street on the morning of November 28th. In year 1, Maison Fontenot didn't have enough customers to cover rent. I cooked 4 dishes per dinner service, not because I didn't know more, but because I was alone in the kitchen and couldn't manage more. After each night, Auguste and I would sit at the kitchen table tallying whether we could make next month's rent. In year 3, the Times-Picayune ran a short piece on Maison Fontenot. Not a major review, just a paragraph in the local dining column. But it was enough that the following week we were fully booked for the whole week. In year 5, I hired 2 prep cooks and a server. Christophe, 10 years old at the time, would often come by after school and sit in the corner of the kitchen, doing homework while I cooked. Marguerite, 7, would stand on a step stool and watch me chop. Renee, 4 years old, slept in a little bassinet in the storage room. I remember those evenings in the particular way that you remember what mattered most. Not the extraordinary moments, but the most ordinary ones. The ones that came and went without anyone marking them until they're gone. In 2002, 17 years after opening, Maison Fontenot was mentioned in Bon Appétit magazine as one of the finest Creole restaurants in Louisiana. Christophe was 22 and studying business administration at the time. "Mama, we should open more locations," he said. "No," I said. "One restaurant done right is worth more than 10 restaurants done fast." Christophe disagreed. That was the first time I realized he and I were looking at Maison Fontenot differently. I saw the kitchen. He saw the balance sheet. Saturday evening, November 16th. I sat at the kitchen table in the Treme cottage with a bowl of gumbo I had made and Augusta's notebook in front of me. I had cooked the gumbo while crying, not crying from pain or self-pity, but crying from the smell. When I browned the roux and the deep reddish brown began to appear in the pot, when I added the onion and bell pepper and celery and heard that familiar sizzle, that was when the tears came. Not because I was sad, but because I was exactly where I belonged for the first time in 3 months. After dinner, I opened the notebook. The first pages were recipes written in Auguste's hand, an engineer's script, straight and precise. My grandmother's gumbo zahurb, which he'd transcribed as I dictated it to him. The restaurant's jambalaya. In the crawfish étouffée, it had taken us 2 years to perfect. I turned pages slowly, not looking for anything specific, just reading, remembering. On page 47, there was a folded piece of paper tucked between the leaves. I took it out, unfolded it, not 1 sheet, 3. Legal paper, the thick kind, with the letterhead of Dureau and Associates Notary Office on Magazine Street. I read the first page under the kitchen light. Deed of Trust, Beneficial Interest Certificate. This certifies that Adèle Marie Fontenot, wife of Auguste Jean-Pierre Fontenot, holds a 51% beneficial interest in the land parcel located at 14 Chartres Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, 70116, as recorded in Orleans Parish Land. Records, Volume 4892, page 117. This interest shall remain in full effect and cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the written consent of the holder. I stopped, read it again from the beginning, read it a 3rd time. 51% beneficial interest in the 14 Chartres Street land parcel. My name, notarized and recorded in the Orleans Parish Land Records. The 2nd page was a copy of the recording entry, bearing an official stamp of confirmation. The 3rd was a handwritten letter from Auguste, written in the dark blue ink he always used, dated August 13th, 2015, 9 years ago. My Adèle. I'm tucking this here because I know you come back to this notebook whenever you want to remember how we started. I had this recorded in 2008 when I noticed Christophe beginning to have ideas about taking over the restaurant. I didn't tell you at the time because I didn't want you worrying. But I want you to know that land belongs to you. Nothing built on that land, the restaurant, the storefront, the commercial space, can be sold or mortgaged without your signature. You built Maison Fontenot. You have a right to it. Don't let anyone take that from you. Yours forever, Auguste. I read the letter twice. The 2nd time, I held the page against my chest, not for drama, but because it was the closest thing I had to him in that moment. Auguste, I said into the dim kitchen, you really were the most careful man in the world. After Margaret confirmed the documents and before the signing on the 28th, I spent one evening reading the entire notebook from cover to cover. Not the first time I'd ever read it, but the first time I read it completely, page by page, without skipping a thing. The early pages held the recipes I had dictated to Auguste in 1984 and 1985. His handwriting was straight and clear, each recipe recorded in accountant's fashion. Name, ingredient list with exact weights, numbered steps. On page 20, there was a note that was not a recipe. August 14th, 1985. Maison Fontenot opens. Adèle cooks the first dinner service. 12 tables, 8 occupied. Adele is nervous but doesn't show it. I'm more nervous but also don't show it. We're both pretending to be calm for each other. I read that passage and laughed. True, and we had been pretending to be calm for each other for 40 years. Page 35. Maison Fontenot's 10th anniversary. Adele cooks the entire menu from year one as a way of remembering. I sit at the kitchen table and taste each dish. Nothing has changed, and it's better. Page 42. Katrina, the restaurant flooded. Adele stood in the kitchen knee-deep in water, lifting the recipe books one by one. I tried to tell her to leave them, but she wouldn't. She was right. Those books mattered more than I understood. And page 47, where the 3 folded papers were tucked, read, Final étouffée recipe, the completed version. Thank you, the 30 years of testing. Auguste had used this notebook as the diary of Maison Fontenot. Not a personal diary in the emotional sense, but the ledger of an accountant tracking the most important project of his life. And in the middle of all those numbers and recipes and technical notes, he had hidden the most important thing of all. I set the notebook down and looked out the kitchen window. My father's oak tree in the November dark. Auguste, you really were something. Sunday, November 17th, I called Margaret Tran. Margaret Tran was a Vietnamese-American real estate attorney, 48 years old, with an office on Magazine Street. Not a lavish suite like the Fontenot family's lawyer, but a small, practical office belonging to someone who did real work. I'd found her through a neighbor in Tremé who had hired her to settle an inheritance dispute the previous year. Ms. Adele, Margaret answered after 2 rings. I heard about Mr. Auguste. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. I need you to look at some documents. Can you come today? Anytime this afternoon works. Margaret arrived at 3 o'clock. I laid the 3 pages out on the kitchen table in front of her. She put on her glasses and read in complete silence for about 10 minutes. When she looked up, I saw in her eyes what lawyers have when they are looking at something clear and solid. The calm of someone who fully understands what she's seeing. Ms. Adele, I need to verify this against the land records to be certain. But if this document is authentic and was properly recorded, you hold 51% beneficial interest in the 14 Chartres Street parcel. Which means? It means no one can sell, mortgage, or transfer rights to that land without your signature. Any transaction concerning that real estate that lacks your consent is an invalid transaction under Louisiana law. I sat with that information in silence. Does the family know about this? Margaret asked. No. The will's asset inventory doesn't mention the land, only the restaurant as a business entity. Just their attorney clearly didn't check the land records. I looked at the 3 pages. Auguste had it recorded in 2008 without telling me. He didn't tell anyone. A careful man, Margaret said. The most careful man in the world, I confirmed. Margaret took the documents to her office for verification. Tuesday morning she called. The land records confirm everything. Ms. Adele, you are the true legal owner of the 14 Chartres Street parcel. Thursday, November 21st, I heard from Marguerite, my daughter, the only one of the 3 who still texted me occasionally. Marguerite called at 8 that evening. Her voice was low in the way of someone speaking from behind a closed door. Mama, I need to tell you something. Next week, Chris is signing a contract to sell the restaurant. A Houston investment group wants to buy the whole property. They've scheduled the closing for the 28th. November 28th, Thanksgiving. Christophe had chosen Thanksgiving to sign the papers selling Maison Fontenot. I didn't know if that was coincidence or not, but the coincidence had a bitterness to it that bitter coincidences tend to carry. Marguerite, how much did they offer? I asked. $3,200,000 for the full property and brand. $3.2 million. It's for the land that Auguste and I had built up over 40 years using our savings, and all those early mornings and late nights. Does Christophe know about my documents? I asked. No. His lawyer said there were no title issues. But Mama... Marguerite paused. I don't know if you have anything to work with. I just wanted you to know. Thank you, baby, I said. Don't say anything to Chris, and you don't need to do anything else. I hung up and immediately called Margaret. The morning of November 28th, I was up at 5. Not from anxiety. I had slept well. But I'd been rising at 5 for 40 years, the habit of a kitchen person, and my body didn't know what Thanksgiving meant. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, put on the apron with Maison Fontenot embroidered on the chest, the one Sylvie had thrown in the trash. Margaret arrived at 7. She brought the full file, certified copies of all the land documents, confirmation from the Orleans Parish land records, and a legal analysis of my rights in this transaction. What time do we go in? I asked. The signing is scheduled for 10 o'clock at their offices on Gravier. I was thinking we arrive around 9:55. What about a little later, so they're already seated? Margaret looked at me, smiled the way a person smiles when they realize their client doesn't need coaching on how to make a moment land. At 9:58, we were in the elevator of the building on Gravier Street. The 12th floor conference room overlooked the Mississippi River, the kind of room with leather chairs, a long glass table, and sparkling water arranged in neat rows, the kind of room people use to sign important things and want the setting to reflect the importance of it. Christophe sat at one end of the table with his attorney, a young man I'd never met. Beside Christophe sat René. The Houston investment group was represented by 2 men in dark suits. Sylvie sat in a chair against the wall, not at the table. She wasn't a signer, but she wanted to be there to witness. Marguerite wasn't present. She had asked to be excused, citing illness. I walked in with Margaret at exactly 10 o'clock. Not 9:55, not 9:58. 10 o'clock, after everyone had settled in, after the contract had been opened on the table. De Christophe looked at me. His face changed the way faces change when a person sees something they weren't expecting. Mama? His voice made it a question, but it wasn't really. It was the sound of someone quickly calculating what this presence might mean. Christophe, I nodded. René, I nodded to the younger one. Gentlemen, I looked at the Houston representatives. Margaret set the file on the table. I'm Margaret Tran, representing Miss Adele Marie Fontenot. I'm here to notify all parties that today's transaction cannot proceed. On what grounds? Christophe's young attorney rose from his seat. Margaret opened the file and laid the certified copies of the land documents and the Orleans Parish land records confirmation on the table in front of everyone. Because Ms. Adele Fontenot holds 51% beneficial interest in the land parcel at 14 Chartres Street, recorded validly in the Orleans Parish Land Record since 2008. Under the terms of this instrument, no transaction affecting this property may be executed without Miss Fontenot's written consent and signature. Silence in the conference room. One of the Houston men picked up a copy of the document, read it, passed it to his colleague, then looked at Christophe's attorney. "Did you not run a title search?" The Houston man's voice was quiet, but it was not the quiet of someone at ease. Christophe's young attorney opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I did. The title search didn't show." "Beneficial interest recorded via deed of trust under a specialized clause," Margaret said evenly. "It doesn't appear in a standard title search to anyone who doesn't know Louisiana real property law thoroughly." Christophe looked at me. This time his face was no longer composed. "When did you know, Mama?" "Last Saturday," I said. "Your father left it inside the tattered cooking notebook you all handed me at the attorney's office." Sylvie said something from the corner of the room. I heard it, but had no need to respond. What mattered had already happened. "This meeting is concluded," one of the Houston representatives said. "We will be back in touch once the title status has been resolved." The two Houston men stood, gathered the unsigned contract into their briefcases, and left the room. No handshakes. While Margaret and Christophe's attorney began exchanging documents, Renee, my youngest, 38 years old, stood and came over to me. Renee was the child I worried about most and understood least, not because he was bad, but because he had a habit of following where others led without having the spine to bear the consequences of those choices. "Mama," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." I looked at my son. "Sorry for what?" "For not saying anything. I knew you'd be upset, but I let Chris and Sylvie make all the decisions. I should have spoken up." "Renee," I said, "staying silent when you know something is wrong is also a choice. You made it, and you have to live with it. But if you genuinely want to start over, truly start over, I'm still here." He nodded, said nothing more, left. Christophe did not speak to me before he left, and neither did Sylvie. That, too, was an answer, and enough of an answer for me to understand that not everyone is capable of changing when they stand in front of a mirror. I want to say something more about Christophe, not to excuse him or to attack him further, but because this story isn't complete if I only see him one-dimensionally. Christophe grew up with parents who were consumed by work, not indifferent. We were not indifferent, but the restaurant was the fourth member of our family, and sometimes it demanded more than anyone had planned for. I remember one afternoon when Christophe was 8 years old. He had a soccer game at school, and I had promised to come. I couldn't make it. The restaurant had a kitchen crisis, and I had to stay. Auguste couldn't make it either because he was dealing with the supplier. Christophe came home and said nothing, not angry out loud, just quiet in the way of a child who has learned not to expect too much. I remember that. I tried to make it up in other ways. But the things you use to make up for something are never quite the same as the thing itself. Growing up, Christophe learned to look at the restaurant the only way he could approach it without it hurting, as a financial asset, not as memory. That was his defense mechanism. I understand that even when I can't accept the consequences of it. But understanding why someone does a wrong thing doesn't mean the thing carries no consequences. That was something I also had to learn, not just about my children, but about myself. When Christophe called me in January and asked for help, I could hear in his voice something I hadn't heard in a long time. A child who didn't know how to ask directly for what he needed. Not because he was immature, but because there are some things a person never learns when they grow up in a busy restaurant family. I didn't forgive him completely in a single moment. Not everyone can do that, and I don't blame myself for it. But I left the door open, not from weakness, but because I am 72 years old, and I know that anger is a weight old age doesn't need to carry. Sylvie sat in the corner of that conference room on November 28th and said nothing when I walked in. I looked at her once and then focused on the people at the table. I could say a great deal about Sylvie, about the aprons in the trash, about the smell, about all those months in their house on Esplanade when I felt like a guest in my own son's home. But what I want to say about Sylvie isn't any of that. What I want to say is, I don't know what made Sylvie who she is because I never knew her well enough to understand. We never really sat down together and talked. Not from hostility, but because no one ever created that space, and I was partly responsible for that too. I let my reserve around her harden into distance, and that distance became a space where contempt could grow unchallenged. I am not saying this to excuse what she did, throwing the aprons in the trash, calling traditional Creole food old lady food. Those things reflect genuine disrespect. But disrespect doesn't grow from nothing. It grows in spaces where there is no connection, no conversation, no understanding. I have learned this in the kitchen. When a dish doesn't turn out right, you don't simply blame the ingredients or the recipe in isolation. You look at the entire process and ask what happened and where. I need to say more about Marguerite and that phone call. Marguerite Fontenot, my daughter, 41 years old, was the child closest to me in spirit, though not in geography or time. She lived in Uptown, worked as an accountant for a nonprofit, and in recent years had often found herself stuck between Christophe's decisions and René's silence. Marguerite was not strong in the confrontational sense. She was strong in another way, the kind of strength that means sitting with discomfort without fleeing, knowing what's right even without the courage to say it publicly. When she called me Thursday night, November 21st, her voice was low in the way of a person speaking from behind a closed door because they don't want to be overheard. That itself said something. She knew calling me was something her brother wouldn't want, and she called anyway. After November 28th, Marguerite called again. This time not a low voice, a normal tone, from an open room, not a closed door. "Mama, I'm proud of you," she said. That made me pause for a moment, not from surprise, but because the timing was right. Not right after I walked out of the conference room with feelings still running high, but a week later when things had settled, and I was sitting in the kitchen making red beans and rice for a Sunday supper. "I'm proud of you too," I said. "Me? You called me that Thursday night. You knew Chris wouldn't like it, but you called." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if you had anything to use. I just thought you should know." "Sometimes knowing is enough," I said. "Thank you, Marguerite." The relationship between me and my daughter was never the simplest thing, No relationship is between two people who have both lived long enough to have edges and histories. But that Thursday night phone call was something I would carry, not because it changed the outcome, but because it reminded me that within my own family, there was still someone who saw what was right and did what she could. Margaret and I met 3 times in December to work through the next steps. The legal situation at Maison Fontenot now stood like this. The land at 14 Chartres could not be sold without my signature. Auguste's will had left the restaurant as a business entity to the 3 children, but that business operated on land I controlled. This was what Christophe's attorney had overlooked, and what had caused the Houston group to walk out the moment they understood it. Christophe contacted Margaret after the Houston group withdrew, not directly to me, through his attorney. That too said something about him. They offered to buy out my beneficial interest for $1 million. I declined. Not because the price was low, but because that was not what I wanted to do. They offered a management agreement. I retain the land rights. They run the restaurant. They pay me a monthly management fee. I considered this longer. But then I thought about Sylvie and the 3 aprons in the trash. And I thought about the late nights in the kitchen and the early mornings at the market. And I knew that handing Maison Fontenot to people who didn't understand why the smell of a kitchen was a good thing, not a bad thing, was not what Auguste had built it for. I want them to buy out their business shares from each other, I told Margaret. They can sell their ownership stake in the business entity and divide the money, but the land stays with me and I will lease it. Lease it to whom? I don't know yet, but not Christophe. In the 2 weeks from the time I came back to Tremé until November 28th, I cooked every day, not for guests or for work, just cooked for myself, cooked to be present, cooked because that was how I thought. Saturday, gumbo, the 3-meat version following my grandmother Eulalie's recipe. Sunday, red beans and rice with andouille sausage, the traditional Louisiana way, soaking the beans overnight, sautéing the onion and bell pepper and celery, adding the sausage and herbs, letting it cook on a low simmer for 3 hours. Monday, étouffée. I sat at the kitchen table alone with my bowl and Auguste's letter in front of me. Cooking for yourself when you live alone is something people tend to skip. People say it's not worth the trouble for just one person. I don't agree with that. Cooking wasn't only about feeding myself. It was what kept me connected to myself, to the people who taught me, to the reason I had devoted my life to this craft. One afternoon that week, my neighbor, Mrs. Delphine Joseph, 85 years old, who had lived in Tremé longer than I had, stopped outside my kitchen window and inhaled. "Adele, what are you cooking in there? It smells wonderful." "Étouffée, Mrs. Delphine. Come have some." We ate together at the kitchen table that afternoon, 2 older women with bowls of étouffée, talking about Tremé and New Orleans, and what had changed and what had held. It was the best meal I had in months. Mrs. Delphine asked me what was going on when she heard I had come back to Tremé to live alone. I told her not everything, but enough. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Adele, I knew Auguste from when he was young. He was the most careful man in this neighborhood. If he left something for you in that notebook, he left it with a reason." "I know, Mrs. Delphine, and you're no less careful than he was. You did what you needed to do. That from Delphine Joseph, 85 years old, who had lived in Treme longer than I had. That carried a weight that not every word of praise carries. In January of the following year, I opened my first free cooking class at the Treme cottage. It wasn't something I had planned in advance. It formed naturally out of conversations. After the November 28th signing that wasn't, I got calls from people in the Treme community. News traveled the way it travels in Louisiana neighborhoods, which is faster than any wire. Someone asked if I wanted to teach traditional Creole cooking, not for a hotel kitchen, but for the young people in the neighborhood. I thought about it overnight, then called back and said yes. The first class had 8 students, ages 16 to 25, from Treme and the 7th Ward and the 9th Ward. None of them knew how to make gumbo properly. One didn't know what a roux was. A roux is the soul of Louisiana cooking, I told them in that first session, not because it's complicated, but because it demands attention. You cannot make a good roux while you're thinking about something else. The kitchen teaches you to be here and now. I taught them how to brown a roux, taught them to hear the difference between onions caramelizing and onions burning, taught them why crawfish étouffée needs just the right heat and never a lid. And I taught them what my grandmother had taught me at age 10. Food is memory. When you learn to cook your grandmother's gumbo, you are holding on to something of that person. No one can take that away. After 3 months of teaching, I realized that what the students in my cooking class were learning was not only recipes. A young man named Marcus, 18 years old, from the 9th Ward, raised without a father, his mother working double shifts at the hospital, showed up to the first class with the posture of someone who was only there because someone else had made him come and who had no intention of staying interested. He stood in the corner with his arms crossed and watched me work the roux with the expression of a person waiting for the predictable disappointment. I handed him the wooden spoon. You stir. I don't know how. That's why you're here. Marcus stood over the pot and stirred. The roux started to change. The first 5 minutes there was nothing remarkable, just flour and butter in a pot. But around the 15-minute mark, when the deep caramel color was building and the smell was rising, he stopped stirring and looked into the pot. It smells different now, he said, because it's turning into something, I said. You stand here and pay attention, it becomes a roux. You walk away, it becomes charcoal. He looked at me for a moment. That sounds like philosophy. That sounds like cooking, I said. A lot of things in the kitchen sound like philosophy if you're paying attention. Marcus became the most dedicated student in the class, not because he had some romantic awakening about cooking, but because he recognized that learning something real, standing in front of it and giving it your full attention, was valuable in a way no one had taught him before. I don't know if Marcus will become a chef, and he may do something entirely different, but he learned how to make a roux and what the roux teaches: patience, attention, the practice of being here and now, that he will carry. Christophe called me once in January, not through his attorney, directly, his own number. I answered, "Mama, it's Chris." That was the voice I'd heard since he was a child, the voice of someone who wanted something, but didn't know how to ask for it straight. "I'm listening," I said. The restaurant is in trouble. Ever since the Houston group pulled out, other investors have been nervous about the title situation. We can't get financing to keep operating." I sat with that information. "Chris, what are you asking me?" I'm asking if you can help." I looked out the kitchen window at the cottage in Treme, my father's oak tree, planted in 1952, now 3 times as tall as the roof line. "You handed me a tattered notebook while signing away $3,200,000. That's what you thought I deserved." I said this not to attack, but to make sure we were both looking at the same reality. "You're right." Christophe's voice, for the first time in this conversation, lost its business coding. "I know you're right." I thought it over. "Here is what I can do," I said. "I will sign a document granting use of the land on the condition that the restaurant operates according to my approval. No selling the brand to a chain, no changing the core menu, and I have a seat on a culinary advisory board." I paused, not to control you, but because that is what your father built, and that is what your father wanted preserved. "And Sylvie?" he asked. "That's between you and her." Christophe agreed to the conditions the following week. Sylvie was not at the signing meeting. This time it was a different kind of meeting. No Houston investment group, no glass table and bottled water in rows. Just me and Margaret and Christophe and his new attorney in Margaret's small workroom on Magazine Street. In March, I went to Maison Fontenot in my role as culinary advisor for the first time. Christophe had changed some dishes on the menu without consulting me. That didn't surprise me. But he had kept the core dishes: gumbo, étouffée, red beans, and rice, bread pudding with whiskey sauce. I sat and ate my way through the tasting, made notes, said what I thought. Gumbo is right, but needs filet powder. Étouffée has more butter than it wants. Bread pudding is good. Whoever's making it is following the recipe. Christophe sat across from me and listened, didn't argue, which was unusual in a way that suggested things were beginning to shift. "Can you work with the new chef?" he asked. "If the new chef wants to learn." Nobody learns anything they don't want to learn. James wants to learn. He's 28, went to culinary school, but he knows that Louisiana Creole has to be learned directly from people who carry it. You can't get it from a textbook. I met James LeBlanc, the new head chef at Maison Fontenot, the following week. A 28-year-old man with the hands of someone used to kitchen work and the eyes of someone genuinely hungry to learn. "Miss Adele," he said, "I know you have no reason to teach me anything, but I want to learn the right way." "Wanting to learn the right way is reason enough," I said. "Next Monday, 7 a.m. We start with the roux." The kitchen keeps passing itself forward, not because of obligation or contract, but because there is someone who wants to learn and someone who knows how to teach. That is the best way important things are kept alive. Someone asked me after this story became more widely known, after the Times-Picayune piece, after the phone calls from other women who had been through something similar, what kept me from falling apart in that November? I thought about the question for a moment before answering, because the answer was not as simple as I would have liked. The answer was the kitchen, not as a metaphor, literally. When I came home to Treme on that Friday night with the notebook, the first thing I did was not cry or call anyone or go online. The first thing I did was cook gumbo, and while browning the roux, holding the wooden spoon, and stirring steadily and watching the color shifting and smelling what was rising from the pot. I was not thinking about what had happened in the attorney's office. I was here, now, in the kitchen, with the roux. And that is what the kitchen teaches, being here and now. You cannot make a good roux while worrying about tomorrow. You cannot cook a proper gumbo while angry about the past. The kitchen demands complete presence, and what enforces that demand is the most natural consequence possible. If you don't pay attention, what's in the pot will burn. 72 years in and around kitchens gave me that, not as an abstract lesson, but as reflex, the kind of thing that lives in the body, not the mind. The second thing the kitchen taught me is that patience is not the same as passivity. A roux takes 15 to 20 minutes and cannot be rushed. But you are not standing still. You are stirring steadily, watching, adjusting the flame. That is not passive waiting. It is active doing while letting time do its part. And I did that in November, waited for the right moment while doing what needed to be done to prepare. I didn't walk into the conference room on the 15th, the day of the will reading. I didn't call Christophe the moment I found the documents. I let Margaret confirm and prepare. I waited for the right time. The third thing, and this is what my grandmother Eulalie taught me before I was tall enough to see into a pot without a step stool. Cooking is how people say, I see you, I care for you, I want to nourish you. Not in words, but in the most specific way possible. Ingredients, time, attention. When Christophe was 8 years old and I couldn't make his soccer game, I should have cooked him a special supper that night and told him directly why it mattered to me that I hadn't been able to be there. I didn't do that. I made it up in other ways. But not in that way, not in the language of the kitchen. That is something I could have done differently. Not the only thing, but the thing I think about. Now, when I teach Marcus and the other students in the free cooking class, I try to teach not only recipes. I teach what cooking means, that it is an act of care, that the most important thing you put into a meal is not the ingredients, but the attention. The flavor of truth is always the strongest. And the truth of the kitchen is this: what you cook with love is different from what you cook with indifference. The diner cannot explain the difference, but they feel it. That is why people came back to Maison Fontenot for 40 years. I am writing these words on a morning in March, sitting at the table by the window overlooking Rittenhouse Square. No, that's the wrong city. Sitting at my kitchen table in the Treme cottage, a cup of chicory coffee beside me, and the sounds of my neighborhood coming in through the open window. The free cooking class now has 20 students. Not large, but every one of them has learned how to brown a roux and understands why that matters. Next month I'll teach jambalaya, and after that red beans and rice, the traditional Monday dish of New Orleans, the food people eat when they want to feel like they're home. Maison Fontenot still operates at 14 Chartres Street. Christophe runs it. René helps with financial management. I hear he is learning from the work, in the way that sometimes only real consequences teach a person. And I serve as culinary advisor under the terms we agreed on, which means I come in about once a month, eat my way through the menu, and say what I think. Sylvie appears at the restaurant less than before. I don't know why, and I don't need to. Marguerite, my daughter, who called me that Thursday night, comes to the cooking class sometimes, not because she doesn't already know how to cook, but because she said, "Mama, I want to learn from you while you're still teaching." That was the finest thing any of my children has said to me in years. Augusta's notebook now sits in the kitchen cabinet, not tucked away, but right at the front of the shelf where the students can see it. No one touches it. But I keep it there so people know that good recipes don't come from nowhere. They come from people who stood in kitchens and thought and failed and tried again. Looking back on this story, there are things I want to say, not as lessons, but as truths I have learned the hard way from inside my own life at 72 years old with nothing much left to hide. The first is about what people call wealth, the big house, the restaurant, the balance sheet. Those things are real and have real value. I don't deny it. But 40 years have taught me that people often confuse the kind of wealth that accumulates with the kind of wealth that can sustain you when everything else goes sideways. My grandmother Eulalie was not wealthy by the first measure, but she was by the second, and that was what she passed on to me. The second is about Auguste, and he didn't tell me about the land documents because he didn't want me to worry. I understand that. But I also think he knew I would find them at the right moment, in the cooking notebook, where he knew I would turn when no one else was around, and when I needed to remember why what we had built mattered. The most careful man in the world. The third is about the contempt for old age. You're old now. That phrase is not just cruel. It is how people give themselves permission to do things they know are wrong, by convincing themselves that the person being wronged no longer has the capacity to understand or to push back. That is false. Old people do not become less capable. They become more patient, and patience can look like weakness until the moment it doesn't. The fourth, what my grandmother Eulalie taught me and what I now pass along to the young people in the cooking class. The kitchen is where you learn to be here and now. The roux will not wait for you to be distracted. The gumbo will not cook itself. The kitchen teaches attention and patience and knowing when to turn up the heat and when to lower it. That is not only a cooking skill, that is a way to live. I don't know what the coming years will look like. I am 72 years old, and none of us knows that. But I know that this morning I will teach the cooking class, and 20 young people will learn how to make a roux and understand why the smell of a kitchen is a good thing, not a bad thing. And I know that Augusta's notebook is in the kitchen cabinet, right at the front of the shelf, looking out over the kitchen of the Treme cottage. The flavor of truth is always the strongest. And my truth is this: I built this. I am still building, and nothing, no will, no daughter-in-law, no signing ceremony can take that from me.